Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Joel Poost. I'm chair of the philosophy department here at the University of Delaware. This is the 7th, I believe, in a series of debates we've sponsored over the years on a variety of topics of controversy and social concern. Tonight's debate is also sponsored by the Department of Anthropology and by the Department of Women and Gender Studies. I'm grateful for their support in this endeavor as well. Our aim is to have substantive and serious debates about what's true, not what's politically expedient. Our aim is to do so in a sustained and detailed fashion, not in 30-second sound bites or 3-minute TikTok videos. These folks are not YouTube influencers. They're scholars. That's why they're here. So we're going to be debating, or they will be debating, whether biological sex is binary. We've got two people debating here. The first is Agustín Fuentes. He's professor of anthropology at Princeton University. He specializes in evolutionary and biological anthropology. He's the author of a large number of articles and a number of books, the most recent of which is, pardon my arm, Sex is a Spectrum, The Biological Limits of the Binary, published last year by Princeton University Press. I commend it for your attention. The opposing side will be defended by Professor Tomas Bogardus. He's professor of philosophy at Pepperdine University. He works mainly in metaphysics and epistemology. He's the author of many articles and, quite recently, a book, The Nature of the Sexes, Why Biology Matters, also published last year, hot off the presses, as it were, by Routledge. The way this is going to work is each of these debaters will have about 15 to 20 minutes to, as it were, present or state their main case. Then they'll each have 10 minutes or less to respond to the case of the other, perhaps expand upon their own. Then we'll have a kind of open, probably about 15-minute session between them where they can question each other and engage in dialogue. At pretty much precisely 5:25, we'll stop everything, at least amongst them, and we'll open the floor to audience Q&A. That will be moderated by my colleague over here, Professor Richard Hanley. If you have a question, if you have a comment, if you have a criticism, you are more than welcome to voice it, but we ask that you come down the aisle, you line up here at this mic, which will be manned by Professor Hanley. Please be mindful of the fact that he has to accommodate every question if he can. Please be mindful of the fact there are other people. Don't hog the mic. Don't grandstand. Ask anything you like. Ask critical questions, but make your point, as it were, if you can, and move on. Normally, I would just say thank you for being here. So thank you for being here. Thanks to our debaters for coming. Thank you. But this appears to have, this debate has generated some controversy. I've seen and been the recipient of messages objecting to its very occurrence, so I'm going to poach some time from my guest and say a few things about that. The main criticism I've seen is that debating this topic is somehow harmful to people. I should emphasize we're debating whether biological sex is binary, whether or not that relates to gender or gender identity, and how it would do so is an open question. People have different views on that question. That's not our question. It's related, or they are related, but it's not the exact question we're interested in. We're talking about biological sex, the thing we humans share with vast swaths of the animal kingdom. That's our topic, our primary topic. The main post I've seen criticizing this says the university should center teaching based on evidence and compassion and the well-being of students. And then it goes on to say, and I've seen this in emails I've received, that academic freedom is fine, but it shouldn't extend to interfering with student well-being. But I guess I have to say, I don't know what this is except argument and evidence. I don't know what this is except argument and evidence. These are people who wrote books defending their points of view. As I say, they're not YouTube influencers. They're not out to get clicks. They're not out to enrage people. They're out to figure out what's true. And I think figuring out what's true, what we have evidence for, should be the North Star of any university that's worth its salt. Of course, nobody deserves to be abused. Nobody deserves to be, like, personally disrespected. And people should be physically safe. But the idea that we should limit academic freedom on account of what makes people uncomfortable, if well-being is construed in the way people seem to be construing it, I wholeheartedly reject, and I invite you to do the same. If we said we shouldn't debate things that make people feel unhappy, render them feeling unsafe, or in some sense unwelcome, we wouldn't have debates about abortion. That's going to make people who've had abortions feel unwelcome. We shouldn't have debates about Gaza, because maybe that's going to make Jewish or Palestinian students who strongly identify with various causes feel threatened or unsafe. We shouldn't have debates about racial discrimination, because that's going to make the people who benefited from it feel unsafe, or the people who are alleged to have committed it feeling unsafe. I just think there's no end to that principle, and it can't be where a university is going to lie. Some of you may be well aware that in Texas, there is now a legislative prohibition on teaching, sorry, they say advocating for, but it's really teaching certain topics. If we tried to have this debate at Texas A&M, it would be prohibited. And it'd be prohibited because of Professor Fuentes' position. That's what the Texas legislature says. Some of you, maybe not all of you here, but some people said we shouldn't have this debate here. And they said it because of Professor Bogardus' position. I don't see a difference. Right? The Texas legislature says the gender binary is not up for debate. And some of you apparently think, right, the opposing view is not up for debate. That kind of attitude is just poison for a university. And it doesn't matter whether it comes in a red chalice or a blue chalice, it's poison. And it will result in universities becoming more fragmented, being unable to fulfill their truth-seeking and educational mission, and making our pluralistic and divided democracy less healthy. So, enough speechifying from me. You're here to hear from both of these speakers. I implore those of you who are here and disagree to conduct yourself with comportment and civility. Make your point. By all means, disagree, argue, but do so civilly. And with having said too much, I'll concede the floor to Professor Fuentes. Thank you.
All right. Organismal biology matters. Bodies, lives, and ecologies, they develop together. And sex is part of this. Humans are biocultural animals, right? Our bodies, our lives, our societies, they develop together. And sex is part of this too. So let me lay down a few basic points and then try to convince you why binary framing is not beneficial biologically or intellectually when engaging sex. But first, let's say, what is sex? Which you think might be a silly thing to say, but it's quite important. Sex is a biological and evolutionary process. Sex is a reproductive process. Sex is a social process. Sex biology is all the stuff in our bodies that is related to sex. And in fact, sex biology as a way to categorize bodies, behaviors, and variation in a species is what we're actually talking about today. All right? So I want everyone to be clear what we are actually talking about. That people use, scientists, scholars, use sex biology as a way to characterize bodies, behaviors, and variation in a species. Now, what is sex biology? It's all this stuff. There's an enormous amount of stuff which is all connected in complex ways, which we can get back to later. But the point is that this is what sex biology is writ large. And we can disarticulate this a little bit, and we will today. All right, when I say a binary, what am I talking about? I'm talking about a system composed of two kinds, often depicted as absolute opposites, true, false, off, on, 1, 0. 1 and 0 are both numbers, right? Same category, but they don't have anything to do with one another. They are two distinct kinds. When a spectrum right? When I talk about a spectrum, I'm actually talking about a distribution of material, of all the same material, that appears in different clusters, typical clusters, with some of that material distributed outside of those typical clusters, right? So they distribute predominantly in these typical clusters, and here I'm talking about biological material, but that distribution, right, also occurs outside of those clusters. This will all become, I think, evident momentarily. So when we talk about humanity, when we talk about humans, we really frequently talk about sex as two typical clusters of gonads, genes, endocrine systems, hormones, what have you, two typical clusters of biology. And that is true. There are two typical clusterings for a lot of this range of bodily variation in our species and in most species. But to think only with those clusters, to think only about these two typical variants, makes it impossible for us to study human biology and variation, because individual variation within those clusters, between those clusters, and across those clusters is substantial. And so understanding the patterns of actual bodies, biologies, and lives in humans is the goal. So it turns out, and here's the punchline, males and females are not the same, nor are they opposites or distinct kinds of human, and not everyone fits biologically into those two categories. Most human biological variation is not distributed in a binary or even dimorphic fashion. Okay? Okay, we can all go home now, right? So let's just take a little tour through biology and think a little bit about this. So animals do sex biology in a bunch of ways. Here's some of Darwin's. Darwin liked pigeons better than peacocks, but here we have peafowl, right? A peacock and a peahen. And this is the way a lot of people think about biology in living organisms. And that is big, colorful male, smaller, drabber female. Something that is clearly distinct, radically distinct between males and females, these typical clusters of biological variation. And this is a pattern that occurs in the animal kingdom, right? Now, we're not going to talk about plants because plants are all messed up. But we'll talk about animals. In the animal kingdom, and you do see sometimes what looks like very dimorphic individuals, that is between males and females. But actually there are many, many ways in which organic life, particularly animals, distribute biological variation across bodies, within species, and within systems, many of which are just not binary. They're not best described in that way. Honeybees have two genomes, two kinds of genetic clusters, and three distinct kinds of bodies. Earthworms, every single earthworm has full reproductive capacities for everything in their own bodies, where they can either sort of service themselves or hang out with other earthworms to reproduce. Many teleost fish, the bony fish, that's a blue-headed wrasse up there, are born, mature one reproductive system, and as their life continues, as their bodies grow, they alter their reproductive system into a different reproductive system, right? And then sometimes switch back. Naked mole rats are just weird. They are mammals. They have pretty typical mammal endocrine and genomic systems, and yet they have three modes of being. One large queen, sometimes two, and then a whole bunch of other females who are sort of like the queen but smaller and don't reproduce at all, but haven't physiologically undergone any changes. Sea turtles, variety of chelonids and crocodiles, so turtles and crocodiles and alligators. Many of them, their sex is not determined by their genome, but rather by the temperature of the sand in which the eggs are laid. There are five kinds of western fence-tailed lizards that have no small gamete producers. There's no males, no sperm producers, just large gamete producers in the species. There's a Crocuta crocuta, a spotted hyena, where females have larger phalluses and scrotum than males do, and use them, get erect phalluses that they put in the male's face to dominate them in social interactions. There is no difference between these female hyenas and many other female mammals. So they're not masculinized. They're just different ways in which bodies and biology is distributed. And finally, there's owl monkeys, really cool nocturnal primate living in South America, where the female gives birth to the infant, hands it off to the male, and doesn't want really anything to do with the infants after that for a long time. Why go through this range? What am I trying to throw out here? That is that bodies and lives of many, many animals do not fit a binary representation biologically and as we'll see, socially. All right, but the argument is, for binary, that there is a really critical difference, and that is anisogamy. That is, most sexually reproducing organisms, animals at least, produce large and small gametes, right? And that these gametes are quite different. And the difference in the size of these gametes is related to differences in their systems of production and the energetic investment and the evolutionary costs, such that those who produce small gametes, sperm, have a very different cost and lifestyle and evolutionary dynamic than those who produce large gametes, females. And that this leads to, as A.J. Bateman said, indiscriminatory eagerness in males to have sex and a discriminatory passivity in females. Or in other words, two different evolutionary trajectories between these two kinds. So the assumption of anisogamy is that these gametes, these differences in sperm or egg investment, really lay out the differences between males and females, and that it's a binary difference. Problem is, A.J. Bateman, who came up with this, actually his data did not support his theory. Now it turns out many animals do sort of follow this pattern, and many animals don't. In other words, this doesn't tell us that much. Let me show you 5 large gamete-producing animals here. Spotted hyena, cotton-top tamarin. Okay, Taylor Swift is not the best example of all humans, but let's just go with her. Red kangaroo, and again, my favorite, the naked mole rat. All of these are female mammals. That is, they produce large gametes, right? So we're going to call them female. Are the bodies, ecologies, physiologies, skeletal anatomies, muscular systems, behavioral ecology, evolutionary histories, and niches of these 5 different females the same? No. In other words, the anisogamy, right, the idea of a big and a small gamete, which is a true part of reproductive physiology for most animals, doesn't actually tell us nearly as much as many people think. So you have to ask yourself, given this entirety of sex biology, all the different things about bodies and lives that are related to reproduction, to sex, to structures of endocrine systems and genomic, gonadal, and other components, why would we only focus on one aspect, right, that has some of the clearest binary division? Well, maybe it's because gametes tell us something definitive about an organism. Like, do gametes tell us about the majority of bodily functions? Do they tell us about cognitive dynamics? Do they tell us about the capacity for social relations and caretaking? Do they tell us about the tendency for aggression? Do they tell us about neuromuscular coordination and abilities? Do they tell us about ecological dynamics? No. Gametes are incredibly important and critical parts of sex biology, but they are not definitively deterministic or even informative about a majority of organismal components. So, while gametes might be a binary part of sex biology and the entire system, we have to ask, what does a body look like? And let's talk about humans now. Let's move away from other organisms. Let's just ask, what do human bodies look like, right? Are they built in a binary fashion? Well, reproductive biology is actually not binary. So if you look at things like gonads and genitals, they come from the same tissue masses. They have, again, typical trajectories with slight differences, right? And sometimes important differences, but they don't come from different things. And in fact, there's enormous overlap in their developmental structures. And for example, in some of the functions, it's not uncommon to have testicular tissue and ovaries and ovarian tissue and testicles that are fully functioning. But then you could say, well, we know XX in humans is female and XY is male. That's totally binary, right? Actually, no, because of the way in which it pays out. XX and XY have multiple possible outcomes. They're the typical patterns, which you can see on either end here, and then an enormous array of different and divergent outcomes across an entire spectrum of possibility, depending on genomic activity, protein reaction, endocrine system, and a variety of other things. So genitals, gonads, and genes are not distributed in binary fashions. Okay, well, what about the rest? I mean, we all know that all men are taller than women. Well, no, we know that's not true. We know there's overlap. There's substantial overlap. While there might be a bimodal or even a dimorphic distribution, on average, those folks we're going to call male, Folks with, let's say, testes and a particular genetic component will be taller than those folks we call female with ovaries and a particular genetic component. There's about a 60% overlap in the distribution. There's an even larger overlap in the distribution of weight. And when we talk about muscles, all of you know, right? Every single human has the same muscles, ligaments, and bones that are distributed in slightly different densities across sexes, so different patterns across the body, but exactly the same actual muscles, ligaments, tissues. Well, we all know that you can look at one of these and tell me whether this is a male or female heart, right? So actually, hearts and most organs do not come in his and hers versions. Organs are not sexed, but they are embodied. That is, organs are shaped by the bodies, but they are not his and hers versions. And again, in the Q&A, we can go over even more of that. What about hair? Well, we all know that males have more hair than females. And in fact, the definition of hirsutism for females is having male-like hair patterns. The only problem is across our entire species, there's a huge variation across groups and locations in hair coverage. And in fact, in many places, as many as 40% of women would be considered hirsute compared to other places. And in other places, men have a lot of hair. Some places, men have little hair. Some places, women have a lot of hair. What's the point? Why am I talking about hair? Because we're talking about distribution of a biological characteristic. And across humans, it varies enormously, and not simply by sex. What about fat? This is the fat deposition is the pattern that I used to use all the time in my classes. In fact, this is from one of my textbooks. And you can see slight differences, particularly in the chest area of male and females. That's an inaccurate representation. This is the actual representation. We all lay fat down in the same areas, right? All humans do. But depending on your hormones, depending on your status, you change it in slightly different ways. The bottom line being is that there's variation in typical clusters with fat, but a lot of overlap. For example, 40 to 60% of those with testes will develop tissue, right? Mammary tissue, the fat deposition or in the upper body around the nipples. Man boobs, right, are a typical part of being human. But we represent them in ways that aren't reflective of that biology. Okay, this is just an example of what I'm talking about. This is by a colleague of mine who was not happy with my book and so wrote a review of it. And here he presented this data of fat deposition in males and females and said, look at the difference. So I want you guys to take away those lines. And I want you to look at the different patterns. Do you see a binary? Or do you see two typical clusters with enormous overlap? Oh, it's on. Yeah. Enormous overlap in the different areas. In other words, you see some typical clustering with a lot of overlap in range in between. Things like hormone systems, right? We all know that progesterone, testosterone, estrogen are human hormones. In fact, they're most animal hormones. How many of you know about male and female hormones? Okay, there's no such thing as male and female hormones. All of us have the same hormones, but there's fluctuating and circulating level differences, some important differences in testosterone, progesterone, estrogen, and a variety of others that pattern out in these typical clusters, but have enormous amounts of variation. So there's no such thing as a sex hormone. There are, in fact, different fluctuating levels associated with typical development and with a range of expression across them. What about brains? Well, we all know there are male brains and female brains. In fact, here's the most recent article demonstrating clearly how different male brains and female brains are. If you look at all the structure of your brain, right, sex explains 1% of that structural variation. 99% of it explained by things that are not related to sex. Reproduction, here's a very important, absolutely clear difference, right? If you have a uterus and mammary glands, milk-producing globules, you can gestate and lactate. This is a real difference. However, it is important to point out those with the uterus who do not gestate and lactate have physiological, neurobiological, and endocrine differences that are substantially different from those who do. Plus, we know, and this is established by enormous amounts of research, that humans, envisioning human reproduction by talking about one individual is problematic, that humans have a cooperative caretaking system that has changed all of our bodies and physiologies in especially important ways. So when we talk about human reproduction, to talk about one individual is to talk about one piece of the system. Again, this is a spectrum of physiological, biological, and in the case of caretaking, social components. All right. Sex biology is about patterns and variation. It's not about a binary. I've done this very quickly, but at least you should get a taste of where we are. Females and males are not the same, nor are they opposites or distinct kinds of human, and not everyone fits biologically into those categories. Many humans do not. Most human biological variation is not distributed in a binary or even dimorphic fashion, and here's my favorite part, being human is just a lot more complex and wonderful. So, attention to actual bodies and lives rejects a simplistic binary frame and provides the groundwork for a better conversation. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much for coming, and thanks to all the groups who organized this event. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks especially to Professor Fuentes for sharing the stage with me. There's my email address under the picture there if you want to communicate with me after this debate. You're totally welcome to email me. And that URL will allow you to download these slides if for some reason you wanted access to these slides. All right, so what I'll be doing today is presenting a couple arguments that sex is binary. So when I first started having these conversations a few years ago, I thought the way to approach this question is to try to answer this question: how many sexes are there? And then once you figured out what a sex is and how many sexes there are, if the answer is 2, well then that means sex is binary. But it turns out the issue is more complicated than that. And something that's interesting about this debate is my conversation partner today actually agrees that there are 2 sexes. Professor Fuentes agrees there are 2 sexes. Here are some quotations of him saying as much from some recent podcasts last June. He said, "I'm not saying there's more than 2 sexes, there are male and female. That's how we're talking about it." He also said in December, "When I say sex is a spectrum, people think, oh, 3 sexes, 5 sexes. No, 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 humans have 2 sexes, but nevertheless, sex is not a binary." And then here's another one from last June. "A spectrum doesn't mean there are more than 2 sexes, etc." Okay, so what we're going to be talking about today is the move from there are 2 sexes to the conclusion that sex is binary. I'm going to try to convince you that that is a safe inference to make. Professor Fuentes denies it. Before I look at some arguments, let me just tell you what I think the sexes are. So that was the subject of the book that Dr. Pust mentioned, The Nature of the Sexes, that I recently published. Here's the bumper sticker version of what the sexes are. I think the sexes are biological functions. To be a male is to be an organism with the function of producing sperm. To be a female is to be an organism with the function of producing eggs. I think this definition works across the plant and animal kingdoms. So I think that's what biologists have been talking about this whole time. So a lot of people, when they hear that view, they immediately think, well, wait, not all males produce sperm and not all females produce eggs, and that's true. Not all males presently produce sperm. Juvenile human males don't produce sperm. Maybe due to old age or injury or disease, sperm production ceases. That can easily happen. I think embryos have a sex, male or female, but they're not producing sperm or eggs. But that's consistent with the view that I just laid out. In fact, that's the nature of a function. Something can have a function and yet fail to fulfill it. Something can have a function and fail to fulfill it. So just for an example, which is based on a real life story, my car has a sound system with functions even if it can't operate now due to some unknown mysterious internal damage that I never figured out. So it has functions, it just can't fulfill it. All right, so that can happen. A couple more notes about sex. I think there could have been more than 2 sexes, and maybe one day evolution will unfold in such a way that there are more than 2 sexes, but as of now, there are only 2. Okay, so does that mean that sex is binary? I do not think that dictionaries are infallible. They make mistakes all the time. But there are worse places to start if you're trying to figure out the meaning of a word. If you look up the word binary in the dictionary, you'll find entries like this: involving 2 things, having 2 parts. Here's what Merriam-Webster says: made of 2 things or parts. And so a lot of people involved in this debate think that settles it. Sex is binary because it involves 2 things, male and female. There are 2 sexes. Something's a binary if it involves 2 things, so sex is binary. In fact, many people on my side of this debate would say, yeah, that would settle the case. If there are 2 sexes, sex is binary. Here's evolutionary biologist Colin Wright saying as much. He says, when biologists claim that sex is binary, they mean something straightforward. There are only two sexes. But since we still have this room for over an hour, I thought maybe we should think a little more carefully about that inference. That's the inference we're going to be investigating today. I think it might be a little too quick to go just from something involves two parts to the conclusion that it's binary. After all, consider bicycles, binoculars, married couples. These things all have two parts. They involve two things. But I don't think these things are accurately described as binary. I'm told that it takes two to tango, but I don't think the tango is described as a binary dance. So yeah, probably just having two parts is not enough to be a binary. We should probably, I think, focus on this entry in Merriam-Webster, which says that in order for something to be a binary, the components of the binary have to stand in a certain relationship of what Merriam-Webster calls diametric opposition. The Oxford English Dictionary agrees that for something to be a binary, the categories, it's not enough just to have two categories, they have to stand in the right sort of relationship of opposition or contrast. That's what's required for something to be a binary. The OED also says, hey, you might want to check out the entry on gender binary, which I thought was good advice. And that actually leads to my first argument. We can call it the gender binary argument. We are often told that our culture's dominant system of gender is binary, a man and woman. That's what makes it binary. And sometimes the same is said using our sex terms, male and female. So the idea is that if there's a gender binary, then those two gender categories must stand in the right sort of oppositional relationship to count as a binary. And then my thought is, whatever relationship that is, it looks like the sexes stand in the same sort of relationship. So if two genders mean a gender binary, two sexes should mean a sex binary. And here are some people on the other side of this debate who seem to say as much. Advocates for trans equality say that the idea that there's only two genders is sometimes called a gender binary because binary means having two parts, and then you get sex terms, male and female. Dictionary.com defines gender binary as a system consisting of two genders, and then we get the sex terms, male and female. Here's Dr. Anna High, who says Western society has traditionally assumed a gender binary, classifying sex and gender as male or female. Here's Dr. Crystal Scheib, I think that's how you say her last name. We anthropologists love to shake up notions of what is natural and normal. One common assumption is that all cultures divide human beings into two and only two genders, and she says that's a binary model of gender. Okay, just a few more. Dr. Karen Blair in Psychology Today says the gender binary is the view that gender comes in two distinct flavors, men and women. And she also says that a lot of things in our society are based around this binary understanding of sex and gender. Okay, University of Minnesota Medical School talks about the gender binary, and then again the sex terms, male and female. The Trevor Project talks about the male-female binary. Minus 18 says the same thing about two gender options making a binary, and then we use the sex terms again, male and female. Okay, so there's the initial case. There are only two sexes, and many folks on the other side of this debate say that would be enough for a binary when it comes to genders, and sometimes they seem to say that it would be enough for a binary when it comes to sexes as well. Here's just one more quotation from Beans Vlachi, who's at University of Pennsylvania. So the book is called Sex Isn't Real, the Invention of an Incoherent Binary. So there's a wide diversity of views on the other side of this debate. Some folks say sex is a social construction, it's not real, doesn't exist independently of our mind. Beans Vlachi is an example of somebody who holds that sort of view. But in this book you'll find the quotation, I use binary and male and female roughly interchangeably. So there's some more evidence that even folks on the other side think if there were only two sexes, that would be a binary. Okay, here's another argument. We can call it the gamete binary argument. So Professor Fuentes grants that our system of gametes is binary, sperm and eggs. Gametes are just our reproductive cells. In organisms like us, there are just two of those, sperm and eggs. Professor Fuentes says that's a binary system. Gametes can be described as binary, he says. They come in two types. That's a binary. Here's another quotation from a recent podcast. Gametes form a binary. They're totally different all the time. So the argument is, hey, look, sexes do the same thing. They come in two types, male and female. If that's enough for gametes to form a binary system, then it looks like it's enough for the sexes to form a binary system. Okay, so those are my two arguments that sex is binary. Let me, with the rest of my time, respond to a couple arguments that Professor Fuentes has given to deny that sex is binary. The first one we heard earlier today, just a few minutes ago. We can call it a no overlap argument. It goes like this. Here's how he said it back in last October. He said, let's clearly identify what we mean by binary and what we mean by spectrum. So a binary is two things that may belong to the same category. For example, here we have numbers, a 1 and a 0. So two things that belong to the same category, but they have no overlap. They're completely distinct. They have no overlap at all. So it looks like an attempt to explain what Merriam-Webster means when they say that the components of a binary have to be diametric opposites. So a talk of being completely distinct, I think, is an attempt to flesh out what's required for something to be a binary. Reminds you of what we read in Merriam-Webster. Should remind you of the OED entry about the components needing to contrast or oppose each other. Okay, so I think the argument's going something like this. Something's a binary only if it involves two things that belong to the same category but which have no overlap. So that's necessary for something to count as a binary. There can't be any overlap. And the problem is the sexes may involve two things. We agree there are only two sexes, but they don't stand in the right sort of contrasting or oppositional relationship. They have overlap. So that's why sex is not a binary. Okay, so what philosophers do is we like to evaluate arguments. So let's turn to evaluating the argument. I think the first step in evaluating the argument is trying to get clear in our minds what it is to have overlap. What is it to say that two things have overlap or have no overlap? Here's one interpretation of what it is to say that A and B have no overlap. Maybe what's meant is they just have nothing in common. They share no characteristics. So you can think of all their characteristics, and if any characteristics are shared, well, then there's some overlap. So there's no overlap when no characteristics are shared. Okay, on that interpretation, step one, I think, is not true. There are counterexamples. There are cases of binaries where the components of the binary share things in common. So for example, even 1 and 0 share many things in common. We're told they're both numbers, and that's true, but they're also both whole numbers, they're both integers, they're both non-negative, they're both rational numbers, they're real numbers, they're less than 2, they're less than 3, and so on. So they actually have like infinitely many things in common, the 1 and 0, but nevertheless they form a binary system. Okay, the same thing goes with genders, gametes, and lots of other binary systems. If you just think about the gametes, they form a binary system according to Professor Fuentes, but sperm and eggs share a lot of things in common. They both involve cytoplasm, they both have nuclei, they both have genetic information in there, they both have mitochondria, little phospholipid bilayers. So they have a lot in common, and yet nevertheless form a binary system. So let's try again. I think a more charitable interpretation is to think of the sexes as features of organisms, so being male and being female. And maybe what it means to say that two features have no overlap is to say that they could never be had by the same thing. So nothing can be both F and G. That's what it is to say that two features have no overlap. So consider the feature of being a circle and the feature of being a square. No shape can have both of those properties at the same time. No shape can be a square and a circle at the same time. So maybe to say that something has no overlap is to say that these two properties can't be co-instantiated, can't be had at the same time. Okay, but as we heard in Professor Fuentes' opening statement, some organisms are both male and female. You heard about earthworms. Here's the reproductive system of your ordinary garden snail. I don't mean to shock you, but there are both male and female components in there. We got a male reproductive system, we got a female reproductive system. Your humble garden snail is both male and female at the same time. Okay, so that's just the fact of the matter. The sexes can be had by the same organism. There are some organisms that have both sexes, both male and female at the same time. Okay, so if premise 1 were true, then it looks like premise 2 is true about the sexes, and so this conclusion would follow. But I think step 1 in this argument is false. I think there are counterexamples. There are cases of binaries where the two things involved can be had by the same thing, can be co-instantiated. So for example, consider that one battery can have both an anode and a cathode. Both components of a binary system of polarities can be present in the same one battery. One computer program can have both ones and zeros, both components of that binary system of code. One molecule can have both components of a binary system of charges. There's one right there. It's your ordinary water molecule. Binary songs, binary explosives, binary star systems, binary molecules. Each of those things contains both components of the binary. And so maybe the same thing could go with sexes. Sexes might form a binary system, even if there are some organisms that have both sexes. Okay, let's try one final interpretation of this argument. Maybe what it is to say that A and B have no overlap just means they're distinct. And so with regard to the sexes, what that would mean to say that the sexes have no overlap That would mean to say that there's no third sex that's a blend of male and female, the way that orange is a blend of red and yellow. Okay, and then what premise 2 would be saying in this argument is that there is actually a third sex that's a blend of male and female, the way that orange is a blend of red and yellow. But I think that's just not true. Step 2 is false. There is no third sex like that. Any sex you pick, anytime you find a sex in nature, it's either male or female. There's no third sex. Sometimes you'll find both sexes in one organism, but you'll never find a third sex. Okay, just like in a computer program, any bit you choose is either 0 or 1, never both. Any star in a binary star system is either star 1 or star 2. It's never both. Okay, so we've tried 3 interpretations of this argument. Those 3 interpretations all failed. So I conclude that this argument is not going to succeed. With the little remaining time I have, let's look at one final argument for thinking that the sexes are not binary. We can call this the same stuff argument. Here's how Professor Fuentes put it back in October. He said a spectrum, whether an example like this, light or sound or a variety of other things, a spectrum is the same materials that are distributed across a range that fall into typical clusterings. So it's got to be made of the same stuff, and we've got a distribution across a range. So I think the argument goes like this. Something's a spectrum if it meets this condition. It involves things made of the same stuff, where the stuff is distributed across a range, may fall into typical clusterings, and guess what? Sex meets that condition. Sex involves 2 things. They're made of the same stuff, the stuff is distributed across a range, etc. And so that's why sex is a spectrum. So just real quick, by way of reply, I think that step 1 in this argument is not true. I think there are counterexamples. There are cases of things that meet this condition. There are binaries that meet this condition, and they're not properly described as spectra. So the fact that something involves things that are made of the same stuff, distributed across a range, et cetera, that's not enough to be a spectrum. It may well be a binary. Think again of sperm and eggs. That is a binary system, according to Professor Fuentes, but sperm and eggs, as I said already, are made of the same stuff. And the stuff is distributed across a range and may fall into typical clusterings, and yet nevertheless forms a binary. Okay, also men and women, I dare say, they're made of the same stuff. And yet they form a binary star, it's a binary star system. They form a binary system, according to, for example, the advocates for trans equality. Okay, 2 stars are also made of the same stuff, but they can form a binary star system, even though they're made of the same stuff where the stuff is distributed across a range, etc. Okay, so I don't think that argument's going to work either. Okay, so in conclusion, there are only 2 sexes. If 2 genders mean that gender is binary, and 2 gamete types mean that gametes are binary, then I would think that 2 sexes mean sex is binary. Professor Fuentes has given 2 arguments for the conclusion that sex is not binary, but I don't think those arguments should convince us. Remember, that was the no overlap argument and the same stuff argument. So we should conclude then that sex is binary. All right, thank you.
All right, well, now we're going to do sort of 2 rounds of just sort of response, although I think I have to admit right away that Professor Bogardus has convinced me that maybe in some ways gametes are not binary. All right, what do I mean when I apparently say quite a lot, there are 2 sexes? And I think this is a critical component here. I mean that sexes as categories are typical clusters of biological variation in Homo sapiens, or whatever species you're talking about, and that there are 2 such typical clusters in humans. And I think the typical cluster explanation here is important. Sexes are pattern variations on a theme, Homo sapiens biology, rather than 2 distinct types of biological system or entity. The range of variation in human biology includes more than is found in these typical clusters. That is, not all humans fall into these typical clusters. I think this clarification is important. So there are bodies and variants in bodies that do not map to the core parameters of these typical clusters, sexes. Not all humans fit into the cluster male and female, right? So understanding what this means, and when I say 2 sexes, we have to understand these are typical clusters, not a comprehensive overview of all of the biological variation present. So when I say there are 2 sexes, I am explicitly not referring to a binary distribution of biological variation, but rather to typical patterns of clustering of the existing variation within that system, right? So that's what I'm referring to. And I am not alone Here's just a bunch of just biologists who over the last few years, and for many years, but these are just from the last few years, have talked a lot about how better understanding or contemporary understanding of biological variation is pushing against, for many, many biologists, the thought, the notion that a binary framing is the best one to understand sex biology and bodies across many, 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 many species. I encourage everyone in the audience to take a look at this literature because it's quite broad and pronounced. All right. Gender binary. Professor Bogardus references the gender binary sort of to talk about a sex binary. I think this is really important because I think we might disagree on what gender is. As an anthropologist, I see gender as this, right? The contextualized social and structural experiences framed by social cultural systems, societies, and cultures that include norms and societal expectations for behavior and appearance, as well as individual expressions of identity, expectations, experiences associated with sex, bodies, and categories. Gender is not simple. Gender, right, while there are a range of common patterns, is not a fixed entity cross-culturally or over time. Gender variation is quite substantial. So only two genders, the idea of a gender binary, is actually what is being criticized. Professor Bogardus offers us a number of quotes. Those quotes are actually criticizing the assumption that there are two genders. The whole idea of a gender binary does not actually map, right, the terms man, woman, masculine, feminine, and a variety of other ways in which social scientists and many, many other scholars assess gender demonstrate that the binary actually doesn't work when you measure gender and when you talk to people about gendered experience. And I think that's a really important component. Another component, and this one I think is really great, and thank you for the image here. No sex is a blend of male and female, as orange is a blend of red and yellow. And just to sort of push back on that, this is exactly what I am saying, that in fact multiple aspects of our bodies and of human lives are orange, right? That bones, muscles, hormone profiles, mosaic gonads, gene activity, protein structure and activity, mosaic gene expression, receptor dynamism, adipose deposition, hair patterns are in this overlap space. We have two typical clusters, but within those clusters, a lot of variation, and between the clusters, a lot of variation, right? I have a jaw, a mandible, right, whose angle here is much larger than 90 degrees, atypical for someone with testes like me, okay? Variation, typical clusters, and a range of expression across that. All right, so let me just really quickly just sort of figure some things out here. And I would like to suggest that the argument that Professor Bogardus is presenting, that sexes are the things that they are sort of designed or built, created to do, make gametes in this case, it's not really a biological argument. This is an essentialist philosophical one. Now, let me point out, most arguments about what humans are philosophical arguments, essentialist or otherwise. That's fine. It's just you cannot invoke biology to justify it, because biology does not map to that distribution and pattern. Instead, one can talk about bodies and biology and their variation and find that it is not a simple binary to best describe these patterns, even when we're talking about reproductive physiology, right? Which is sort of centered in the discourse on the binary. Also, if we're honest and understand that humans are biocultural organisms, which that's our whole bread and butter as anthropologists, our bodies, lives, and societies develop together, as I said a few moments ago, then the binary representation is even less apropos. So the question remains, why is there this desire, why are we having this debate, right? What is the goal of sort of using a binary in this kind of context? And I'd say because binaries' assumptions about only male or female are used to naturalize expectations that are associated with gender or sex contexts, aggression, nurturing, sports ability, all these kinds of things. There's a way to say, hey, this is because you're male, this is because you're female, this is because you're a man, this is because you're a woman. This argument of the binary allows you to make these essentialist arguments. The problem is all of these kinds of things none of them are in fact essential characteristics of sexes or genders, nor are they simple traits. These are all complex traits without single origins and patterns, and in fact, none of these things are directly and mostly not even obliquely related to gamete production. Okay, so let me just wrap up here. Why devotion to the binary? Why not just stick with two sexes, right? We could just say two sexes. Why the term binary? What does that do? What does that add here? What is the intellectual or structural contribution? Binary asserts that all human bodies and their associated experience, dynamics, and biological variation can only, and if you'll notice a lot of the definitions that were used, the word only was in there, can only be accurately described as being in one of two clusters, and nothing can be outside of those patterns. This is not biologically accurate, period. So, human biology and human experience does not map neatly or cohesively into such a pattern where there are two distinct clusters with no overlap or no space in between them, or individuals that do not map into these clusters. So, sex biology, as I said, is about patterns and variation, not about a binary. Males and females are not the same thing, nor are they opposite or distinct kinds of human. Not everyone fits biologically into these categories. And that's really important because when we actually look at bodies, we understand that biological variation is not distributed in a binary or even dimorphic fashion. Most of it. There are some patterns, although now I'm going to have to debate the gametes thing again. Finally, being human is a lot more complex and wonderful, and I end the same place I ended my introduction. Attention to actual bodies and lives rejects a simplistic binary frame, but it does provide the groundwork for a better, even if more complicated and somewhat messy, conversation. Thank you.
Okay, so I think after this response, we'll have a little time where we're talking directly to each other. And at that time, I would like to address some of the things that were just said. But in the meantime, I want to pick up on an argument that I heard in the opening statement. There again is another URL. If you wanted these slides for some reason, you could use that URL. The argument that I heard in the opening statement went like this. I think it was a new version of the spectrum argument. It was on this slide in the upper right-hand corner. I think we got a new condition for something to be a spectrum. And the condition is, well, if something is a distribution of variation involving gradual transitions with no abrupt changes or total discontinuities, then that thing's a spectrum. Okay, and then the idea is sex biology is like this. And I think the assumption that comes next is sex biology just is sex. And so if sex biology meets the condition to be a spectrum and sex biology just is sex, then it's going to follow that sex is a spectrum. With my time in this little response, I'd like to focus on those step 2 and step 3. Let's start with step 2, the claim that sex biology is like this. So remember that sex biology is a term that refers to all the features or characteristics that are associated with an organism's sex that vary according to sex. Sex-linked traits, traits that are linked to sex or related to sex. Professor Fuentes helpfully gave us this pyramid of sex biology. And you'll see things like genes and chromosomes, gamete production, genitals, secondary sex characteristics. We heard a lot about patterns of body fat deposition, patterns of body hair, et cetera. These sorts of things are aspects of your sex biology. Your hormone levels vary according to sex, your height. Okay, these are all aspects of sex biology. Now, my concern is that some of sex biology might meet that condition to be a spectrum, but certainly not all sex biology meets that condition. And then we'll talk about the assumption that sex biology is sex, which I also think is false. Okay, but just let me really quickly explain what I mean. I think that these sorts of features are not like, they don't meet that condition to be a spectrum. I couldn't find, I put sex hormones on there. I did it, even though we were told there are no sex hormones. There are certainly hormones that play a crucial role in sexual development. That's what I mean by sex chromosomes, or sex hormones. So I put those on the pyramid, and I highlighted gamete production and genes and chromosomes. So these are features of sex biology that I don't think meet that condition to be a spectrum. Other features might. So for example, in Professor Fuentes' book, we saw this graph of human heights, which shows, we're told, the usual graph for the range of heights in the United States when comparing 3G male and 3G female bodies. So just for what it's worth, I think that this graph is misleading. I think that this gives a misleading impression of how much the heights overlap. If you just look at this graph, you'll see a whole lot of overlap. And it looks like there's a very gradual transition. The change between men and women is not very abrupt. But yeah, as I said, I think this graph just couldn't possibly be right. If you look at the number of men that are said to be under 5 feet, according to this graph, and the number of men that are said to be over 6'6", that is very hard to believe that there are so many 6'6" men outside of the Netherlands. There's also one guy up there in the booth found out, and if you see him later, you'll know who I'm talking about. But there just aren't that many men under 5 feet tall and over 6'6". Professor Fuentes says this graph came from Anne Fausto Sterling. He cites the CDC data, but I don't think this came from the CDC. Shout out to Ed Hagen at Washington State University for pointing this out. There are better graphs, and to his credit, Professor Fuentes showed us one of those graphs, and there you can see the number of men under 5 feet tall and over 6'6", and it's just a teeny tiny little sliver. Again, outside the Netherlands. So I mentioned that just to say that even in the best case scenario of an aspect of sex biology that meets the condition to be a spectrum, the transition is much less gradual than we were led to believe. The change is much more abrupt than we were led to believe. And it gets worse when it comes to things like testosterone levels in men and women. There are the typical women testosterone levels on the left, the testosterone levels in the typical man on the right. And you'll see that this is not a gradual transition. The change is quite abrupt. May well be a total discontinuity. If there's overlap, it's very small. Okay, and I think things, again, get even worse when it comes to gamete production. There we're just told on this picture of sex biology that that's a binary. And at one time, before tonight, Professor Fuentes agreed that the gametes form a binary system. So that aspect, that very important aspect of sex biology is not a spectrum. Similarly with sex chromosomes, I don't think that very important aspect of sex biology is going to meet this condition to be a spectrum either. If you went around just checking people's sex chromosomes, I guess that would be unethical. But if you did, the way to chart the results would be using a bar graph, right? We just have bins or categories where we'd put people. Most humans would have either XX chromosomes or XY chromosomes. There certainly are sex chromosome aneuploidies. It's a small percentage of the population. I'm not trying to ignore or overlook that fact. I'm just telling you, if you were going to chart the sex chromosome arrangements in humans, it would be a bar graph. We'd have categories. There's no distribution with gradual changes, gradual transitions, no abrupt changes, et cetera. So there's another very important aspect of sex biology that doesn't meet that condition to be a spectrum. So I think that the most we could say is that some sex biology meets that condition to be a spectrum. And so if sex biology just is sex, then the most we can conclude is that some sex is a spectrum. Okay, but let's turn now to this step. I know that we are reaching a natural end of our attention spans, but I just ask you to please lock in, as the kids say, for a few more minutes, because this is very important. What I'm about to say is very important. I think that sex biology is not sex itself. Sex biology is not sex itself. That's not what it is to be male or female, each of these aspects of sex biology. And I believe that Professor Fuentes disagrees with me. I think he assumes that sex biology is sex. And sometimes he just flat out says it. Here's a quotation from last October where he says, "When I say sex, I'm really talking about sex biology." Today, I just added this really quickly. Today we heard that sex biology didn't get what was in the middle, is what we're actually talking about today. Sex biology is what we're actually talking about today. Here are some other quotations that you can look at later to assure you that I'm not taking quotes out of context or cherry picking quotes. I think that Professor Fuentes and many other people on that side of the debate, I should say, think that sex is sex biology. Here's one more bit of evidence. We saw this slide in the opening statement. The question was, what is sex? One of the answers was sex biology. All the stuff in and about bodies related to sex. So I think what's going on here is Professor Fuentes thinks that the term sex is ambiguous, and I agree. But he thinks it's ambiguous in a way that's particularly relevant to this debate. I think he would grant that there's one sense of the word sex on which it refers to the genus of the sexes, what it is to be male or female. But he thinks there's another sense of the word sex on which it refers to sex biology. And so you might worry, oh no, does that mean this whole debate is a merely verbal dispute? And when someone says sex is a spectrum, they're using the word sex in one sense. And when someone says sex is binary, they're using the word in a different sense, and we're just two ships passing the night. So the good news is I don't think that's true. I think that if there is some truth about what sex is, and I think there is, then if someone were to say sex is a spectrum, they would just be misusing the word sex. And I think that's what's going on. It would be like this. Macaques are monkeys, I found out. I chose that example for Professor Fuentes. Macaques are monkeys. If I were to say macaques are apes, I would say something false. I would misuse the word apes, even if in my ignorance I intended to use the word ape in such a way that included monkeys and apes. That doesn't matter. That doesn't get me off the hook. I still said something false because that's not what the word ape means. So in the same way, I think that if there's a truth about what the word sex refers to, then somebody who says sex is a spectrum, intending to refer to sex biology, may be making a similar kind of mistake. So here are 3 quick arguments that sex is not sex biology. Sex is not sex biology. There's no meaning of the word sex on which it refers to sex biology. Argument number 1 has to do with Joe Rogan. His sex biology has changed over the years. That's true. Green check. That means that's true. Joe Rogan's sex biology has changed throughout the years. From embryonic development through puberty, more recently on testosterone replacement therapy, there's been pretty significant changes in his sex biology. Yet, it is false that his sex has changed over the years. His sex has not changed over the years. I can't hear any true reading of sentence B. But if there were a sense of the word sex on which it referred to sex biology, you should be able to hear a true reading of sentence B. So the fact that we can't hear a true reading of sentence B indicates that there's no meaning of the word sex on which it refers to sex biology. Here's a second argument. Just need to quickly remind you that sex biology is all the stuff in and about bodies related to sex. I'm thinking that stuff has a mass. So for example, if you took the sex chromosomes out of my body, there'd be some mass of sex chromosomes in this test tube. That's actually DNA in a test tube. If you took all the testosterone out of my body, you'd have a dangerously large amount of testosterone. Just kidding. You'd have some mass of testosterone. So yeah, sex biology, at least some aspects of it, has mass. So that should mean then that the sex biology of a male whale is greater than the mass of the sex biology of a male nematode, right? Because whales are just so much bigger than nematodes. They have more sex biology. So the sex biology is more massive. That's true, green check for that sentence. But it's false that the mass of the sex of a male whale is greater than the mass of the sex of a male nematode. Right, that doesn't even make sense. Sex itself doesn't have a mass. Okay, so that gets a red check. That doesn't make sense. So again, that's more evidence that there's no meaning of the word sex on which it refers to sex biology. Third argument involves Timothy Chalamet. I thought it was Chalamet, but my daughter corrected me and said, it's Chalamet, father. He does not have the same sex biology as that male mulberry tree, even though he's doing his best impression of a male mulberry tree right there. They do not have the same sex biology. That's true, green check. But they do have the same sex. It's false to say that they have different sexes. They're both male. They have exactly the same sex. There are mulberry trees that are exclusively male. So they have exactly the same sex. So there's more evidence that there's no meaning of the word sex on which it refers to sex biology. Okay, so where does that leave us? We had an argument where it looked like the most we could conclude is that some sex is a spectrum. But if sex biology is not sex, then really the most we could conclude is that some sex biology is a spectrum. We can't even conclude that some sex is a spectrum. Okay, I'm not a graphic designer, but I just quickly whipped this up. This is the original cover of Professor Fuentes' book, Sex is a Spectrum. But I think it would be more accurate, much less catchy, but more accurate if we made it a little more complicated and said some sex biology is a spectrum. I think that is the most that has been proven here, that some sex biology is a spectrum. Okay, if you give me one more minute, I will try this one more time. Let's say, let's set aside sex biology. Let's just think about sex itself. Sex itself meets that condition to be a spectrum. It is a distribution of variation involving gradual transitions with no abrupt changes and no total discontinuities. So sex itself is a spectrum. And when you consider this argument, it might bring to mind certain graphics that float around the internet, like this one. Maybe you've seen this one. And I guess the idea is there on the x-axis, we line up people according to their biological sex. On the left, we get the super masculine males who show you what they eat after chest day. And then on the right, we get the super feminine females. And then the idea is there's going to be a range of biological sex in between, so sex itself is a spectrum. I think this kind of chart traces back to a paper from Anne Fausto Sterling and others in the year 2000. You see a similar kind of chart there. So just a quick evaluation, you might wonder, what is going on the x-axis there? What's going on what are we measuring on the x-axis? We're told by Anne Fausto Sterling and others that we're measuring variability in size or composition of gonads, genital morphology, chromosomes, and/or hormonal physiology. So you can probably guess my response right now. That is not sex itself. None of those things are sex itself. Biological sex is a function. It's the function of producing sperm. That's what makes an organism male. Function of producing eggs. That's what makes an organism female. Functions don't come in degrees. It can't be plotted on some continuum, on some x-axis like that. If you were going to see how the sexes are distributed in like the human population, a bar graph would be most appropriate. We'd have one category for the humans that are only male, have another category for the humans that are only female. We'll leave some categories available if it turns out that there are true simultaneous hermaphrodites, humans that are both male and female. Maybe it's philosophically possible, I think, that there be a human who's neither male nor female. I think those are going to be vanishingly small, but again, it doesn't matter how rare they are. The point is just this kind of graph suggests that sex is a category, not a spectrum. We don't have a distribution of variation with gradual transitions and no abrupt changes. We've got categories. Okay, so in conclusion then, if sex biology is sex and sex biology is a spectrum, then sex is a spectrum. But that is literally a big if. We saw 3 good reasons to think that sex biology is not sex. And crucial parts of sex biology are not a spectrum. Things like our sex chromosomes, things like testosterone levels in adult males and adult females, things like gametes. These are crucial parts of sex biology that are not spectra. Sex itself is not a spectrum. And we previously saw good reasons to think that sex is binary. So we should still conclude then, I say, that sex is binary. All right, thank you again.
Do we have, what, 5 minutes?
I don't know.
5 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, real quick, I'll go and then you go and we'll see where this goes.
Okay.
Thanks, actually, Professor Bogardus, for that. I think that is very clarifying in some important ways because just a couple things really quickly, for example, on chromosomes. Chromosomes are artifices. That is, the chromosome is actually a sequence of DNA and all of the genes on them. And so if you look at the genes on them and their activity and processes, you will find that they actually exhibit in a broad spectrum of activation and things like that. So I think using just the chromosomes is a picture of a binary or a dichotomous sort of framing, but it's actually the gene activity that we were talking about. So I think that that example doesn't stand up. But the real point I want to make here, and I want to have enough time to have this discussion, is if sex does not have mass, I'm a little stunted, or I stumble here because biology has mass, right? And we're really interested I'm interested in measuring things and understanding things. I'm really interested in human bodies and how they work. And if sex is a sort of a perceptual assignation, right, of dynamics, then I'm not as interested in it. I'm really interested in what bodies do, how lives are, how people experience their bodies, how society engages with bodily variation and experience, and the notion that there is a sort of philosophical function and that should be used as the category to engage bodies with mass and lives and experiences, then I run into a little challenge there.
All right. Is my microphone still on? I don't know how this works. Okay. So yeah, you said in your response that, so I said biological sexes are functions, and you said functions are not biological notions. This is like philosophical.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to, I went really quick and copied and pasted part of my book. I think that the notion of a function is, you'll find it all throughout biology. You said that biology certainly has a mass. Well, there are some concepts in biology that I think don't have mass, and the concept of a function is one of them. So just for example, in Campbell biology, which I think is the gold standard for undergraduate biology textbooks, I just did a quick Control F search for the word function, and there were 1,820 instances of that word function in Campbell's biology. So biologists love this concept. It's all over biology. In that book, you can read about how RNA has a function, how hearts have a function, blood vessels, kidneys, testosterone is said to have a function, eggs have a function, sperm have a function. Okay, these are all functions. So I think it is a biologically respectable notion to appeal to in a definition of the sexes.
But I mean, you can measure the actual physiological and organic processes of those functions, right? So when you say sex in this broad sense, you say sex is the function of producing sperm or egg. Well, there is physiology that produces sperm and egg, and I think you could argue, I argue, and I think many others do, that envisioning that physiology itself in a binary frame is problematic.
Might be right. Yeah, that might be right, but the physiology that realizes the function is not itself the function. So a function is a more abstract or general sort of notion than the physiology that realizes it. In just the same way that all the chairs in here have the same function, but they're realized in a variety of ways.
Do they all really have the same function?
I picked a chair because I thought it was a clear functional concept. So pick another. Okay, how about this? Quarterback is a functional concept. Quarterbacks are realized in a variety of ways. That's just how functions work. Mousetrap is a functional concept. Mousetraps can be built in different ways, realized by different kinds of matter. Money is a functional concept, can be realized by paper or coins or pelts or Bitcoin, whatever that is. It realizes this function. Okay, so the same thing goes with functions in biology. They can be realized by a wide variety of physiologies, but the function is different from the realizer. Can I quickly respond to something you said about genders, just real quick? You said, so I had given an argument that many people on the other side seem to say that if there were only two genders, that would be a gender binary. We've got this Western concept of a gender binary on which there are two genders. You pointed out that they criticize that view. I agree, yeah, they do not like that view, and they recommend that we move away from it. My thought was just, they agree that if there were two genders, then there would be a gender binary. So genders, whatever they are, stand in the right sort of oppositional relationship such that if there were two of them, we'd have a binary. And it looks like the same thing would go with the sexes. So I don't mean to say there are only two genders. I just mean to say that even folks on the other side agree with me that if there were two, it would be a binary. Do you want to say something now?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't think your microphone's on. Is it on? Oh, it is on. Okay.
Yep, thank you.
There we go.
All right, so let's have another quick round of applause, and then we're going to have a... So please, if you're interested in asking a question or making a comment, please, in as orderly a fashion as possible, line up here, and we'll get you in order. Thank you.
Oh, I also wanted, I don't know if this was said, but there's going to be a reception afterwards. So if you're the sort of person like me who wouldn't feel comfortable asking a question in public where it's recorded, we will be around to talk after the event, right, at the reception.
And in the reception, treat it like a Reddit Ask Us Anything, right?
Oh, okay.
We're ready to go.
I guess so.
Give me 1 second, please. Is my mic on? Yes. Okay.
Well, that guy in the back knows. Is this on? Okay.
Okay. I have to pause my search for Dr. Doofenshmirtz for this. What is your opinion on intersex people that don't fit into that typical binary of man and woman?
Okay. It looked like it was directed to me.
I was hoping my eye contact would.
Yeah. So that's a good question. I was confident it would come up. It's a very natural thing to ask. What I say in the book is I don't think that so-called intersex people, I think more often these days known as people who have a difference or disorder of sexual development, I don't think that's a counterexample to the claim that there are only two sexes, because I don't think that those conditions, I don't think that any one of those conditions constitutes a third sex. And if you think it does, then what I would ask you to consider is what is a sex such that some of these conditions count as a third sex, and how many are there? That's what I would wonder. So some of these conditions, I think, are, I don't think it's controversial to say that some of these differences or disorders of development affect only males or affect only females. There might be, I think I'm open to the idea that some of these conditions are such that it is unclear whether the individual is male or female, and possibly neither, or possibly both. I think that's true. But what I can't understand is the claim that these conditions would constitute a third sex. I think that there are just two sexes and four ways they can be combined: only male, only female, both, neither. So I think that's what I would say about any condition of any disorder of sexual development.
Let me just add on to this very quickly, that I would argue that there's a much more complex reality here, but I would caution against using only disorders or pathologizing the range of variation that we see in human bodies. And I would suggest that much of what is being classified in intersex, this is a much longer conversation, is examples of that variation in human biology that falls outside of the typical clusters. And so I think we disagree in this one sense. That isn't a third sex, it is part of the range of variation of being human.
Oh no, I think we might agree about that. So it is part of the variation in sex biology,
yeah,
for sure, but not a third sex, I would say.
I have two questions. The first one will be for you, and the second one will be for the both of you. So with your first slideshow, you stated on slide 4 that males are organisms with the function of producing sperm and females eggs. I would like to say that I do know multiple people that do not, whether functionally or not, do not produce either. what would you classify that as?
Oh, on that
They
same.
do not have the ability, or were never really intended to in the case of multiple different intersex characteristics.
Yeah, so on that same slide, I mentioned that it is possible to have a function and yet fail to fulfill it. So that might, some of the cases you described might be cases like that, like my car stereo that has various functions even if it can't fulfill it. Yeah, it could be, I'm trying to think if I have any sort of bodily functions that I am unable to fulfill. I don't mean to, that wasn't supposed to be like a brag. I was really hoping there would be an example. But surely all of us have examples like that. Okay, my eyes are failing. There we go. So yeah, without the glasses, like there are certain things that my eyes have the function of doing that they're just unable to do. Okay, so I would say that could be happening in some of the cases you described. It certainly happens in juvenile males. Can happen as a result of injury or disease. But you had also mentioned there might be some people who just never had the function to begin with. So I guess I'd have to hear the details, and I'm a little skeptical that there is an example like that. But if there were an example like that, that would just be somebody who doesn't have a sex, I would say. There are organisms that don't have the function of producing eggs, don't have the function of producing sperm. They're just not sexual reproducing organisms. There are many organisms like that.
The other thing that I'm going to ask to both of you is, as someone who works within data science, we do a lot with different clustering variant things. And one of the big things is that while you setting a number of different clusters, in this case, if we were to cluster all this sex and or sex biology into male and female, why would we choose 2? Would 3 or 4 or 10 or an infinite number be a better classification? There are times when I'm working with different data sets where it's impossible to classify something as one of 2 different characteristics, and then at that point, it becomes much more clear that I need to increase the number of clusters. We have enough differences between male and female traits with stuff, especially myself, mainly. Would it be a better representation if we increased the number of clusters of potential sexes, and therefore, it's not a binary, there's more classifications?
I was going to jump in really quick just to pass the torch, because I think this is a question for Professor Fuentes. I took the question to mean, like, how do we know how many sex biologies there are? If all these characteristics of sex biology cluster in a variety of ways, why say there are only 2 sexes? So I think that's a good question for somebody who thinks sex biology is sex and there are only 2 sexes. As for me, yeah, I'm open to thinking there's more than one sex biology. If you ask me how many sex biologies there are, I'd be like, ugh. There are many ways to have a sex biology. But for somebody who thinks there are only 2, the question might be better directed in that direction.
2 clusters in this basic thing, but it depends on which questions. And here I'll nod to Sarah Richardson and sex contextualism. What questions are we asking? So for example, there are substantial differences between individuals with uteruses who have gestated and lactated and those who have not, substantial neurobiological, endocrine, physiological differences that are justifiably from health conditions, from a variety of other things, different clusters. And so I really appreciate your question, because for me, I'm very interested in what do bodies do? How do bodies experience the world, and how can we understand that range of variation? So I think in that context, and so one of the arguments, and this is a much larger thing, but I would be very careful about making clusters around a variety of things related to health, related to legal structures and all of those kinds of things, because then we are potentially ignoring the clustering of relevance. And I think that's when we look at large data science or different patterns, we can cluster things in different ways. And I think asking, what is the question? What are we obtaining? What are we clustering this biological variation in order to do is the first question that we need to ask.
Would it be a potential for?
Thank you, everyone, too, for asking questions. I know this is not easy all the time.
Hello. I guess I have 2 questions now. One of them is directed at Professor Bogardus. So you described sex as, number 1, a binary, and one binary being that one produces sperm and the other produces an egg. There is a species, clownfish, who they can change their sex regarding like a hierarchical system where a male can switch into a female. Their testes become ovaries and they can breed. How would that fit within sorry,
That's okay. I
within
understand the
your
question.
kind of definition, and also like, how would that make sense in your eyes?
Yeah, you're asking about sequential hermaphrodites. So there are simultaneous hermaphrodites that are both male and female at the same time, but there are many organisms that can switch teams. Some organisms can switch teams more than once. It's not teams. Oh, it's not teams. Yeah, this isn't. There's no battle of the sexes. They switch clumps or clusters. So I'm sorry to be that guy, but I do talk about sequential hermaphrodites in my book, available on Amazon.com. And what I say about those cases is, so I gave you the bumper sticker version of the view that I defend in the book, which is that sexes are biological functions. To be male is to have the function of producing sperm, female eggs. A more careful statement would be that sexes are what I call, I'm sorry about this, activated higher order functions. And to say that they're activated is just to say that functions are if-then statements. Like if certain conditions are met, then here's what follows. And I think that in sequential hermaphrodites, they have both of those conditionals written into their genetic code, as it were. Sometimes one of the conditionals is activated, the if clause is true, and so you'll get sperm produced. And then they can switch and activate the other conditional. So that's what would explain how these fish can accurately be described as male at some points in their lives and female at other points in their lives. So they have that power to activate and deactivate these function conditionals.
And this is actually, I think, a really important sort of thinking through, because a pivotal difference here, and this is related to the previous question as well, is to think through sort of this classificatory system, right? I would argue clownfish, or many of the teleos fish that do this, that they challenge a binary perception because it's one individual, one organism, who embodies this range of biological processes. And so it's the lived experience in the body and the physiological structures that I would argue reject a binary characterization. But I think the real difference here is that I'm very much focused on, I'm very interested in what is the body doing, what is the individual experiencing, and how is that accessible, right? Rather than sort of the activation of this higher order function that Professor Bogardus talks about is a sort of a categorization. So if the fish is producing sperm, it's male. If the fish is producing egg, it's female. That fish is the same fish its whole life. And so I'm really interested in the capacity of bodies to navigate the world, to embody experience and life and physiological dynamism. And I would argue, and I do argue, and we just disagree on this, that that rejects a binary characterization of these things we call sex.
Okay. Okay, that's totally fine.
I thought that both of you made some really great points. I was curious about, first, I mean, we know that males and females do share, like David Page has shown that we share approximately 98.9% of our DNA, other than the sex chromosomes, right? So, but I think also this concept of we're using categories, which is I kind of think what you're saying, to look at data. And some of the data that you showed had a lot of overlap across the sexes, but we know that that's not the case for a lot of different things. So you just happen to show a brain, you know, what are differences between the brains. There are actually, if you look at substructures and other things that the brain do as a function, there's huge sex differences, and some actual structures would be considered sexually dimorphic. Obviously, the gonads are sexually dimorphic, and those, you know, sex differences in the brain often correspond to sexual orientation, which is largely dimorphic, and gender identity, which is largely dimorphic. I'm not saying that there isn't spectrum in here, because I love Jacques Balthasart's work and the role of testosterone influencing these structures across the spectrum and modifying behavior. So I guess I worry about coming back away from sex and then its impact on medicine, because we ignored females for so long until 2015, and so, you know, people like Art Arnold, and they're saying we need to be studying these things because sex matters in terms of actually getting to the first part of individualized health. And so I'm curious, you know, I love your points, and I agree that a lot of these are terminological categorizations, but they're so important when we're thinking about health sometimes too. And yes, go
No,
ahead.
sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No.
No, very good point. Let me just start with one thing very quickly and then come to the health thing. I think this is very important when we think about sort of making these categorical differences like with the genetics or things like that. Remember, all humans have SOX9, it's a gene. If you have an SRY and that SRY activates effectively across about 50 different chemical catalysts that have to happen and it affects SOX9 in a particular way, then something happens. But having an SRY doesn't make you male or female. It's the entire process.
No,
So
yeah,
we have
it
to be
just
very careful about these
differentiates the cells of the
comparisons
testes,
about male and
yes.
female genetics, right? Because
Yes.
those aren't accurate comparisons.
Yes.
It's the dynamic activation of different sequences and their regulatory processes. I just wanted to make that
Yes,
very
yes.
clear. The second thing is cognitive stuff and the brain stuff. I mean, I really encourage, I think Lise Elliott's overview on this is very, very good because I think there's a lot of contention about sort of activation of brain areas. We know that gender and a variety of life experiences change sort of reactivity as measured via either brain activity, but not structure, right? So structures, there's a huge debate. There's no time here, but I encourage people to look at the back and forth between Lise Elliott and some others about structural variation of brains. The final thing is absolutely, right? So first of all, so the misogynistic bias of healthcare writ large, and particularly here in this country, is enormous, right? The understudied of women's health is enormous, and it continues to this day. However, and here I highly encourage everyone to look at the Gender Science Lab at Harvard and Sarah Richardson's work, sometimes dividing individuals out by male or female or man or woman is very important at the beginning of an assessment for health. Sometimes it's not. And I think asking what are your questions, what are you looking at, what specific dynamics are you engaging, especially in the context of precision medicine. Sex is highly problematic for precision medicine because it depends on what question you're asking. You may be asking about variation in receptors, which is based on particular components of life history, rather than a gross characterization of higher order function. And so I think we need to be really accurate and actually stick to the science here. And what we need to do is change systems so that women are not ignored, so that transgender and other individuals are not excluded, and to actually do the work of the healthcare system to study the full range of human biology. And that's I think, where we need to start, and then we can get into the weeds on this other stuff.
Thank you.
It's okay. Sorry.
And that's time.
Seems a lot more complicated.
All right. So hi. First of all, thank you for the nice debate. And second of all, Professor Beauregard, I have a bit of a question. Sorry if I got the name pronunciation wrong. I have a bit of a question, as you mentioned on intersex people and the idea that, and then sort of your answer with that about them being potentially not of either category, potentially being asexual, if you will, basically, in this context. How, if we're using basically this hard binary, this absolute binary as a data set, and basically saying, this is a useful way and this is the best way to categorize these two things, is to say that they are in these absolutes. If we then have a third and we say, well, some humans fall into this third category where they're actually neither because they don't qualify enough to be in the race. On this front, I guess I would ask, in computer science, you got a 1 or a 0. That is a binary. There's absolutely no, it's not a 1 or a 0. It has to be a 1 or a 0. And it seems to be, by being an absolute binary, there can't be this third, oh, well, they're not capable of producing gametes, they're not capable of producing eggs, therefore they don't apply to the equation. I think that's somewhat invalid. From a practical standpoint, intersex people aren't some little note to be put on the bottom of a corner. There are 1.7 million people in the United States, assuming your statistic of 0.5% is accurate. That's a serious percentage of the population, and millions of people. Worldwide, many millions of people in the United States, almost 2. That's a serious portion of the population to basically say we need to disregard all these people from a scientific data, ignoring the potential moral consequences of basically saying these people, aren't male and they aren't female. There's a practical issue of saying, well, we need to disregard all these people from any data that we could potentially apply. Sorry, the mic is running from me. I guess that was kind of my question.
Okay. So, I mean, I tried my best to forestall this sort of misunderstanding by saying, like, I thought I said, I don't mean to disregard or ignore these people, even though the column is smaller, on the bar graph, the column is smaller. It's a very real category. So I tried to forestall this very kind of misunderstanding. Yeah, I don't mean to disregard or set aside or ignore people with these differences of sexual development. So I plead not guilty to that. You had also asked, I guess, a part of your question was why think that there are only two sexes? Is that the question?
I mean, vaguely, like how basically, if a person is capable of producing neither eggs nor gametes, which does happen and can happen, genetic variation is a big thing. If somebody falls into that category, are they suddenly not part of your binary? And if they're, because you basically said as an answer to a previous question that meant they weren't part of the binary. I mean, when you were talking, you basically said, then they aren't male. And then they obviously wouldn't be female because they're not producing eggs because, they don't have any of the capacity to produce that. So I guess my question there is, are they not part of the binary then?
Well, what I had said was two things could be going on. It could be that the individual you're describing has a function that's not being realized, that's not being fulfilled. That could happen. And if so, that person has a sex because they have the function required to have a sex, even if it's not being fulfilled. There may be, I think it is like philosophically, hypothetically possible, that there be humans who don't have the function of producing sperm and don't have the function of producing eggs. Simply not producing sperm isn't enough to show that you lack the function. Just like, I can't see very well, that doesn't mean my eyes don't have the function of seeing. But there may be humans who don't have either function, and then I guess the thing to say is they don't have either sex. So that's what I had said.
All right. Professor
Bogardus.
Yes, Bogardus. Sorry, I've been
okay.
looking over drafting notes. I myself am a very logical person, and I appreciate your attempt to disprove Professor Fuentes through logical fallacy. However, I have a disagreement with your first argument against his points, the second slide of which, in which you try to differentiate gender from other binaries. You arrive at this sort of, I think you called it a circle square definition of what a binary is, that it's two things that can't coexist at the same time. And you disband this because, for example, a computer contains both ones and zeros, and a water molecule contains both positive and negative charges. I don't believe that this rules out the potential for this argument to have basis because, for example, couldn't you say that this room contains both males and females, so therefore it can fall into the same category? I'm just wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, so I meant to show that it is compatible with some things being a binary, that the two components of the binary be present in the same one thing. So you had asked, so I don't mean to say that if the two components of a binary can be present in the same one thing, or if two components, let's say it's part of a binary, if we just notice that two things are present in the same place at the same time, does that mean that those are components of a binary? I don't mean to endorse that. And so I think that's what you were asking me when you said, like, suppose we have males and females in this room. Does that mean, oh no, because then you'd ask, like, does it mean that male and female form a binary? No, that wouldn't prove it. No, yeah, it wouldn't follow. Okay. I mean, there's like, this is a lectern and this is a table, and they're both present on the same stage. That doesn't mean that they form a binary. I just meant to say that it is compatible with being a binary, that both of the components of the binary be present in the same thing. How did that go?
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Hello. My question is primary for Professor Bogardus, but I'd like to hear both of your opinions on this. Please correct me if I mischaracterize your earlier argument. But my question is, if based on some of your earlier statements, things like hormones fall out of the categories of variation, how do you factor in varying hormonal levels across the perceived sex binary? Like, for example, I am, considered in this binary a woman, but I have 8 times the amount of testosterone that a normal woman within the binary should have. So does that does that say something about the binary category? Sorry, the microphone is running away a little bit. Of woman based on hormones, or?
Yeah, so I don't think that the sexes are defined by hormone levels, and I didn't even mean to say that the variation of testosterone in men and women is a binary. I didn't say that. I just showed that graph of testosterone levels in humans and said it doesn't look like this is going to meet the condition to be a spectrum, because that condition was it's got to be a distribution of variation with only gradual transitions and no abrupt changes. Yeah, sorry about that microphone. Whereas it looks like the distribution of testosterone in humans involves a transition that's not very gradual. There's an abrupt change. So it's just not going to meet the condition to be a spectrum. So that was part of my argument that some aspects of sex biology are not a spectrum. So that's all I meant to say. I didn't mean to say that if you have like statistically unusually high levels of testosterone, you're thereby a man. Yeah, I definitely didn't mean to say that.
Yeah.
So I think really just quickly to jump on that, I think that's really important to point out that, for example, it depends on where you measure testosterone, so how that patterns out, right? Prior to puberty, right? Prior to puberty, you don't find these pattern differences. Post-puberty, you find variations, some of which is really large, others which isn't. And so the point of the spectrum notion is that there isn't two distinct patterns, that these patterns are actually part of the same physiological system where different developmental trajectories in the typical context produce patterned outcomes, but there's a lot of variation within those patterned outcomes and between them.
Thank you.
Good evening. All right, so I'm not following almost any of this, so I want to make sure that I'm understanding. So my body no longer produces eggs. It didn't before puberty, and then it did, and now it doesn't. So that's normal development. Do I no longer have a sex?
This is a question for me, I think. Yeah. So again, if you check out my book, available on Amazon.com.
Happy to do it.
One of the challenging cases I consider is postmenopausal females, and what does my view have to say about postmenopausal females? Because I do want it to come out that they're still female, but
And we're all still here.
yeah, and you're all still here for sure.
We all get here, we females,
Yes.
we end up here, surprise.
Yes. Yes, so I am aware of that.
Good.
And what I say in the book is one of two things is going on, I think, with postmenopausal females. It could be programmed deactivation. Okay, I don't mean to endorse any one of these options, but that's one possibility, programmed deactivation. But still, so that would mean that one of the components of the body is programmed to deactivate. This is, I think, called the grandmother hypothesis, and the idea is it was adaptive for some reason in ancestral environments. Well, the reason is for the body to no longer have an interest, so to speak, in producing its own children, but rather to direct those resources towards grandchildren. I'm not endorsing that theory, I'm just saying it exists.
Right.
And so according to that theory, what's going on in menopause is the ovaries are being like forced to deactivate. But still, even if that's the case, the organism has the function of producing components that have the function of producing eggs, even if those components are being forced to deactivate.
So is that like the DuPont company making nylon and then realizing it should run, so it's planned obsolescence?
I do not know much about the DuPont company, but I have noticed DuPont's name is on a lot of things. You're going to have to explain the DuPont.
DuPont used to own the state of Delaware, so that's what's happening.
That's why, okay.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Oh, well, there's another possibility, but.
So I'll skip this, but in the discussion, there's actually some other really interesting things. Darwin had some stuff to say on this, which is actually fascinating, but I'll leave the questions.
Hi.
Oh, you're
I'm
back.
So again, my question is for Professor Bogardus. So do you know what androgen insensitivity syndrome is?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So say you see a man and a woman side by side, how would you sex them?
How would I sex them? How would I come to know what sex the person has?
How would you determine that?
Yeah, so that's like an epistemic question, like how would you know a person's sex?
Yes.
And I guess what we typically do is ask people. There are other ways to know what people's sex are. You can check their driver's license. That's a reliable way of knowing. Yeah, okay, so I guess that's typically what I would do. Oh, something else we do, I don't mean to say that this is right, but something humans do is we're actually I understand we're extremely reliable at sexing other people based on their things like gait and voice and facial structure. So I'm just saying, like, and you can understand why we would have evolved to have those abilities.
Yes.
It's adaptive to be able to find the males and the females. Okay, so if you were to ask me the epistemic question of how do I know whether someone's male or female, I guess that's what I would do. And then your follow-up is, well, what about complete androgen insensitivity
Exactly.
syndrome?
So, how, like, this girl came about her entire life just being a normal girl. She looks like a girl on the exterior. She feels like a girl. And then all of a sudden she goes to the doctor, has a genetic test, and they find out that she has androgen insensitivity syndrome. How would you now place her, now that she looks like a girl, she has the exterior of a girl, her testosterone is not the average or normal level of a man, so she doesn't really fit into any of these categories. So how would you...
Well, you keep calling her a girl.
Yes.
Do you think she's female?
I do.
Okay, so then she does fall into one of these categories, right?
Well, I mean, she has testes, and according to your...
But still a female, you're saying? Okay, so then this isn't going to be an example of a third sex, according to you. So I would say in a case like this, there are just 4 options. Again, either only male, only female, both, or neither. You're asking me to speculate about particular differences of sexual development and render a verdict, but I'm going to resist the bait and say, however it comes out, it's going to be one of those 4 possibilities, which is what the binary view of sex is, or just, I shouldn't even say the binary view of sex is, the view on which there's only 2 sexes, which we share. Well, I guess we share the view. We hold that same view. That's what the view would predict, that there will only be these 4 combinations of the sexes.
But after we're done, there's going to be a reception at the reception.
Let me just yell, she's a girl would be my answer.
Sure. I'll start with a question for Professor Bogardus, and I also would like a comment from Fuentes. So you said that the sexes would be two primary functions. Then you say, I think you're receptive to the idea that sex biology at least has somewhat of a spectrum. I wasn't quite clear on that, but I'm curious why you would, I guess, privilege the reproductive functions as what determines sex. It seems that the broader category of the entirety of sex biology is generally what most people in common language are talking about. And I guess for Professor Fuentes, would you accept that the dichotomy that Professor Bogardus is talking about with regards to the reproductive systems is a real dichotomy, or would you oppose that binary as a subset of sex biology?
Okay, thank you for the question. I understood the question as asking why privilege the reproductive functions as what defines sex. Yeah, so in that book I mentioned already, that's what I try to do in the book, is try to figure out what biologists are talking about when they talk about males and females. And I take a constraint on the project to be trying to make sense of the way terms like male and female are applied all around the plant and animal kingdom. And so what I'm looking for is what is always present whenever an organism is described as male, and what is always present when an organism is described as female. What's necessary to be male or female? Testosterone is not the answer. Even XY chromosomes, I guess I should have led with this. XY chromosomes are not necessary to be male. Birds have a different system of sex chromosomes. Crocodiles and turtles have no sex chromosomes at all. So the sexes are not defined in terms of sex chromosomes, not defined in terms of hormone levels, not defined in terms of genitals. I think embryos are male or female before there are any genitals present. I am told that male birds have no external genitals at all, which now you will notice, which is pretty wild. So yeah, it's none of that. It's none of those sex-linked traits that figure into the definition of being male and female. And what I concluded in that book is the only thing that is always present is this activated higher order function. That's what's always there when an organism's male, even in the case of an embryo, even in the case of crocodiles. So that's the definition, I think. That's what biologists seem to have glommed onto with their talk of male and female. They could have used the words to refer to any number of things. What they're glomming onto is these activated higher order functions. And it is possible, I'll just say this last thing, you had mentioned that what most people in common language have in mind when they use sex terms is aspects of sex biology, and that might be true. But it is possible for our words to refer to things that are like obscure to us. The referent of our words is often obscure to us. That's why in like chemistry we had to do some work to figure out what the word gold refers to. It wasn't apparent to us that it refers to an element with 79 protons. We had to do some work to figure out that what water refers to is 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen atom. It wasn't clear to us from the armchair that that's what it refers to. So in a similar way, we may have in mind various aspects of sex biology when we use the sex terms, but as a matter of fact, what those terms are actually picking out in the world are these activated higher order functions, I think.
So just really quickly, that's a really good question. I think as I keep pointing out, I'm really interested in what organisms do and how they develop and how they engage. And I think the big difference that we have here is sort of whether we're thinking in this sort of sense of sort of what is this broad categorization, or what's the actual lived experience of organisms? What do bodies do? What do lives do? What do societies do? And how do those pan out? And so for me, we could say, if you're really interested in gametes, let's talk about gametes. There's 2 really different trajectories in there, but physiological systems that produce gametes are not binary in that sense. So I would argue that it depends on which question you're asking, but you're right. When people say sex, they're frequently talking about gender, and when people say gender, they're frequently talking about certain perceptions and lived experiences, and all of this is biocultural. All of this is about bodies and cultures and histories together. And I think looking, again, at actual bodies and actual lives and leaning into that complexity is where we're going to get the better conversation. But I do want to thank my colleague and really all of you for talking, for thinking with us. If we don't talk, if we don't think, we all lose. So thank you guys all so much.